Good afternoon. My name is Adriana Link, and I am head of scholarly programs at the American Philosophical Society's Library and Museum. Welcome to today's virtual roundtable discussion hosted by the APS and the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities on climate education as climate action. We're so glad that so many of you have taken time out of what's a very busy time of year to attend today's program. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, particularly to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum, collections, and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check out our website, www.amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. As you may have noticed, we are using Zoom webinar for today's discussion, so not to worry, you've all been muted. If you do have a question, and we hope that you'll have lots of questions for today's presenters, we encourage you to please use the Q&A button that's located at the bottom center of your navigation bar. You can type in your question at any point during today's conversation, and we'll have plenty of time at the end to ask them of our presenters. We're also excited to offer closed captioning for today's virtual discussion. So if you would like to use it, please click on the CC box on the bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It is to the right of the Q&A button. Great, so today's event is a collaboration between the APS and the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities at the University of Pennsylvania. As our participants will discuss in more detail momentarily, it is inspired by two separate projects that connect with educators and students across the Philadelphia area to consider the personal impact of global climate change. So this includes the APS's current museum exhibition on Becoming Weatherwise, a history of climate science in America, and the PPEH's public research initiative, My Climate Story. So I'm pleased now to turn things over to my co-organizer of this event, Dr. Bethany Wiggin, who is professor of German at the University of Pennsylvania and director of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities. And Bethany will also be serving as moderator for today's discussion. So with that, I will welcome Bethany to the Zoom stage and look forward to the conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Adriana, and thank you to everyone who is here joining us this afternoon, and especially to the panelists who will be speaking to us very shortly. I'm going to just very briefly share my screen with you, and I wanted to just introduce to you a little bit about the genesis both of today's program, why we decided to do this, as well as of the My Climate Story project in general. I direct the program in Environmental Humanities, as you heard Adriana say, and we put public engagement at the heart of the various research and teaching initiatives that we do. I hope you'll check us out over at ppehlab.org. I want to tell you a little bit about why we started My Climate Story and why we're so excited to have this program on climate education as climate action. The origins of this program, in my mind at least, go back to a webinar that I took during deep pandemic, as I now call it, with engineers from MIT's En-ROADS program. Maybe you've seen this. It's one of my favorite teaching tools, has become one of my favorite since I learned about the En-ROADS simulator. And basically what you can do is, whether it's in energy supply, in transportation, or in land and industry or carbon, you can move these levers and see here how this global warming may go up or down. So the modeler suggests that these are the solutions that we have. These are the climate actions that we have available to us, and that they are a full and sort of sufficient set of climate solutions. And in this webinar that I was in, I was very excited about the tool, but then I also thought, well, what about if everyone wrote letters to their senators? What about those kinds of public engagements? Can we quantify that? And what, as an educator, I really wanted to know, how does climate education actually move the needle? So they were stumped by the questions. They thought they were great questions. And ever since then, I've really been delving into the literature that really does clearly show that climate education brings down global warming. And with that, I thought, this is something I'm only learning about. Let me turn to experts in the field and get them to talk not only to me, but to a wider public audience about climate education as climate action. And of course, that audience is you. Finally, I'll just make a plea or an invitation for you to check out the My Climate Story project. You can use our simple climate storytelling prompts to share your own story. We have and maintain a public climate story bank, a narrative compendium to the big data of climate change, and we would love to include your story with you there. I've asked each of our presenters to introduce themselves as a way into their work. Each of them is going to talk for roughly 5 minutes or so, and then we're going to discuss some pre-circulated questions that I authored for our experts. And after that, at about 22, we will open the floor for your questions. We really do want to hear from you, so feel free to drop your questions in. We'll be fielding them thematically and posing them to the group. So with no further ado, I'd like to ask Sarah Jaquette Ray to get us going in the next section of our program.
Hi. Thanks so much, Dr. Wiggin and Dr. Link, for inviting me to this important panel and for this topic, and to have a chance to meet the other panelists. My name is Sarah Jaquette Ray, and I'm a professor and a chair of the Environmental Studies Department at what is now called Cal Poly Humboldt in Arcata, California, on Wiyot territory in very far northern California. And I've written a book recently called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet, which is written for college-age students. And what happened to me was that I had my research background was in environmental sciences studies and policy from University of Oregon. And like many people who had a background in environmental stuff, I was not taught how to teach, much less was I taught the emotional dimensions of what was being taught in the classroom. And about 10 years ago, my students started coming into the classroom with big emotional responses to the content that they were getting in the classes. And I started to turn my attention, thanks to another environmental humanist, Jen Ladino, whose work on affect theory and environmental studies has been super critical for me, to suggested to me that I turn my research and energy towards figuring out what the emotional dimensions of a climate education are and how we might leverage those to improve climate education. So that's my introduction. My background was in environmental justice primarily. So I also bring a justice lens to the questions that we'll be asking today. And I really look forward to talking to everybody else. And that's the end of my introduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We're just sharing the link to your books in the chat. And Sarah is the author of a Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. That link will be coming up soon. We next have James Damico and Mark Baildon, who are co-authors, both unmuted and ready to introduce themselves as well.
James, go ahead, please.
Sure. Well, thank you so much again for this invitation, Drs. Link and Wiggin. It's a pleasure to be part of this session. I'm a former elementary and middle school teacher from New Jersey, and currently I'm a professor of literacy, culture, and language education in a Department of Curriculum Instruction at Indiana University in Bloomington. And I've been working on climate change education and literacy and social studies primarily since 2008 here as a professor. And my primary emphasis has been on how we can teach and learn about climate denial, the denial of climate science, and the denial of the actions necessary to address the climate crisis. And thinking a lot about and writing about and working with Mark on how we can reckon with climate denial as a way to construct these pathways to ecological justice. And much of this work has been captured in our recent book publication called How to Confront Climate Denial, Literacy, Social Studies, and Climate Change. In that book, we're just exploring ways to help students in and out of classrooms, in a range of settings, to examine how political, economic, and industry-led denial have led to efforts to misinform us as a public, manufacture this doubt and distrust of scientific information, and to erode the support for the needed policy changes and the collective civic action necessary to address climate-related challenges and crises. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, thanks, James. My name is Mark Baildon, and again, thank you for the opportunity to share some of our work here. I'm currently an associate professor in Foundations of Education at the United Arab Emirates University, and I've been a social studies educator for the past 35 years or so, and most of my work teaching has been I started in the United States, but it's been mostly in international schools. And so I taught social studies in Israel, Singapore, and Saudi Arabia and Taiwan. And I was a professor at the National Institute of Education in Singapore for 15 years before coming to the UAE. As James mentioned, we've just recently published a new book, How to Confront Climate Denial. Most of my work has been around global citizenship education and global education, and looking at how teachers and students engage with different kinds of global issues, including inequality and global flows of media and information, and so on. And recently been working with James around climate change, and more specifically, really looking at climate denial. And so in terms of the social studies aspects of this, really looking at how we can help teachers and students really inquire into some of the contexts of denial that James mentioned, the economic context of denial and the role of fossil fuel industry in sort of perpetuating denial, climate change denial, as well as some of the political contexts, some of the sort of this climate denial machine that we see being kind of spearheaded by fossil fuel industry, but also media context, the social and psychological context, and also the cultural and historical context. So we use a concept of stories we live by as part of this that really revolves around concepts of freedom and progress and so on, and encourage teachers and students to really inquire into eco-justice stories to live by. So trying to kind of shift the paradigm and the ways we think about the world and ourselves in it and our relationship to our natural environment. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark and James. Over to you, Allie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm Allie Rospond. I'm the Museum Education Coordinator here at the American Philosophical Society. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing here with our exhibition. So when I say philosophy, it might kind of give you pause, right? What does philosophy have to do with climate science? So when we were founded in 1743, like Adriana said, by Benjamin Franklin, philosophy meant more natural philosophy or natural sciences. And so what could really be more useful than learning about weather and climate? Now I'm the education coordinator here, so that means I create and implement our different family programs, our tours, our school programs around our exhibition every year. And now Becoming Weatherwise, A History of Climate Science in America is our current exhibition happening now, just almost 2 dates left. And it talks about becoming weatherwise. So that comes from Franklin's quote, some are weatherwise, some are otherwise. And as one of our exhibition advisors says, Franklin wanted us to become weather wiser. And so he wanted us to really learn about weather weather and climate, and to really understand how it worked through experimentation and observation. And this exhibition highlights not just the importance of people like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander von Humboldt collecting this information, but also everyday people. And that's one of the bigger parts of our exhibition too, is community science. And one of our projects that we also worked with was with 2 school groups with our exhibition. So Baildon High School and Newtown Middle School, they collected weather data just like James Madison, just like Thomas Jefferson at their 2 schools. And inside our exhibition, you can actually see some of their work on our walls, the notebook, which is on display, and quotes surrounding it. And really what we wanted to get across here was that everyone can take part in science, and this sort of community involvement and looking at the weather data too can help better inform you. And you can see the students' quotes and their thought about climate science and how to be more informed about it is most important moving forward. And really, what's more useful, right, than engaging with the world around you? And so our exhibition really talks about all that, people's ideas about weather and climate as it moves throughout the 1700s up until modern times. So I'm excited to have our conversation and see what everyone has to say. Thanks.
Thanks to our panelists for introducing themselves. And sorry, turning my video back on here. It's really great. I want to pick up on a couple of things that you all said in order to pose this first question to you. I really appreciated Ali reminding us that, of course, philosophy in the 1800s meant something quite different than it does today. I wonder sometimes if understanding climate may soon become something quite different than it has been in the last 30 years. I think we heard from each of you the ways that that direction is moving, the way that the study of climate, the engagement with climate is becoming science and very, very rapidly. Ali really explicitly talked about the ways that climate science is a community concern in the ways that weather records have been community concerns really for hundreds of years. And some of our most robust historical data, of course, come from community volunteers across the centuries. We've heard the importance of understanding climate denial, its economic bases, also the campaign fueled by the fossil fuel industry. And denial, of course, is also an emotion, an important stage in grief, and has a lot to do with the emotion surrounding climate. Sarah Jacquet-Ray, of course, has written an entire book on climate anxiety, and perhaps some of you have seen my favorite short film with Bill Nye the Science Guy, in which he takes us through the 5 stages of climate grief, which of course include climate denial. And if you haven't seen that yet, I highly recommend you do it. It's a little bit older now, but who could resist having Bill Nye in therapy with Arnold Schwarzenegger? It's really well worth the watch. I want to say, in other words, I want to come back to this question about how climate education is changing really rapidly. And you are on the front lines of that change, I think. Nevertheless, as my example with that model showed, I think education remains undervalued and under-recognized as a climate solution. There are, as we know, and as we have meetings with the IPCC and UNESCO have a shared office of climate education. It's based in Paris. It's a Category 2 UNESCO center. It's not huge. They're doing good work, but it's pretty small. They're not like hugely recognized and funded. And of course, in the United States, climate education receives really very little attention. You may have read Katie Worth's recent book on climate education in the United States. Here in Philadelphia, we're part of course, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and I am sad to tell you that Pennsylvania has received an F in climate education. That failing grade was another reason we wanted to do this webinar today. So I want to ask you, our collected experts, and we'll just kind of go in the order that you introduced yourselves. And can you help us understand why you believe and you practice climate education in humanities and social sciences classrooms, as well, of course, in informal educational settings like the APS Museum? So please field that question and take it in any direction you'd like. And when you're done, just tap the next person. We'll start with you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I love this question. It's a question I've been thinking about now for a long time because, of course, environmental humanists are people like me who was in an English department trying to do environmental stuff. I spent a significant amount of my graduate study, all those 6 years of being in graduate school, having to fight for a table at the environmental, in the environmental conversations, always being the sort of ugly stepchild or whatever the metaphor is in the environmental conversation, and having what I teach my students as something like science inferiority complex. It's like, when are they going to invite us to the table? Why does our knowledge not matter? And of course, I love another Penn person, Ted Toadvine's 6 Myths of Interdisciplinarity. He was in the struggle with me at Oregon when I was doing this, and he was the only humanist faculty I could confide in these problems with. We'd have these great debates about it. And one of his critiques was that the humanities is often seen as sort of the cheerleader. And Stephen Hartman puts this also in a beautiful essay called Outside the Black Box or something of the environmental humanities. And the notion that the environmental humanities' main job is to sort of put the best Thoreau quote on an environmental science insight, that the scientists are the ones producing knowledge and the humanities or the people or the social sciences or the arts or whatever are kind of doing the communication, PR, legwork or cheerleading. And there's gender dimensions to this analogy. You can imagine all the ways that I get my hackles up when I am asked to do that kind of labor for scientists. And as a result of that background, I've spent a significant amount of time thinking about this, and I will try very hard to keep my short. I see kind of 3 answers to the question, and I really want to focus in my response is particular thing about why this has become the case that it has, and I'm pretty cynical, so forgive my cynicism about this. But one of the things that one argument for integrating the humanities and social sciences, just this is like the low-hanging fruit answer. Gus Speth's amazing quote where he says, I used to think that the greatest environmental challenges were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And that 30 years of good science could fix that. But it turns out that that's not fixing the problem. And in fact, the problems are humanity issues like greed and apathy and denial. And we scientists don't know how to fix that. So there's a sort of argument there about there's this big problem out there, and science has been given all of the airtime to be the ones to solve the problem. But in fact, we're misdiagnosing the problem, and these other tools need to be enlisted and centered even in thinking about the problem as a human problem. Now, that's that kind of like easiest answer there. But to go one level deeper to say, why is this the case? Well, one reason is the thing you pointed out, both Mark and Bethany pointing out that there's an economic argument here, right? The capitalism is supporting a particular set of problem closure, or in other words, a way of defining the problem that only circumscribes a certain set of solutions, and those solutions will benefit the status quo, right? So I have a more cynical argument here, which is that the reason the humanities and social sciences are not central to the conversation is because of this kind of coloniality, capitalist assumptions about what defines the environment in the first place, and a very narrow set of definitions about how to solve that problem that will not threaten the existing status quo. So for your example, if you start to bring in questions like land back as a solution to a problem, or even education as a solution to the problem, or even something like grassroots activism as a solution to the problem, to the extent that those solutions define the problem differently or suggest investments and resources being reallocated in a different way, we're going to have resistance. And it's not just big oil, right? There are many, many people who think of themselves as pro-climate who don't want to make those kinds of arguments. So there's a real dualistic root. The dualism of the environment and climate seeming to be something that is outside of human activity. And also there's a very, what I would say, harmful colonial root to that, which is about this sort of mindset of dualism that separates human activity from what's happening in nature and expertizes or managerializes. Timothy Luke has this fantastic article about producing expert natural resource managers as just, that's what environmental studies is, and that supports the capitalist system that exists. So I think one of the places that humanities and social sciences has been excluded is because what we have to offer would undermine the status quo. And we actually have a lot not in common with climate scientists. So unlike the dominant, mode that we are just the cheerleaders or the communicators or the PR for climate scientists, actually a significant amount of the knowledge that we produce in a kind of Foucauldian sense would undermine what scientists are actually saying in some way. So there's a real love-hate relationship there, a difficulty there, and maybe some paradoxes in there that actually make the humanities and social sciences maybe not even very welcome at the table. And in the power knowledge formation hierarchy of capitalism in a Foucault critique, there's no wonder that we haven't been at the table. And I could go on and about that forever, but that's a sort of, I want to say that the humanities are really informed by these justice-oriented, outside the system, break open the system kinds of lenses. And sometimes that doesn't really work with what's happening in the central stages of climate discussions. And I'll pass it off to, I don't know, who's itching to respond or go next.
I'd love to get James and Mark here. I think that there's a lot probably they'd like to build on and respond after that. Really great provocation. Thank you, Sarah. Over to you, James and Mark.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in and kind of pick up on that thread, Sarah. When I think about the question, how can you, in the ways that climate education belongs in humanities and social science classrooms, and well, for starters, when you ask a really simple, straightforward question about climate change, you realize it's not just about science. A question like, why are we now wrestling with climate-related challenges or crises, right? And to answer that question, we need to think and draw on tools and resources, across academic disciplines, as we consider reasons and evaluate different explanations for our current climate reality. Right. So these reasons, as you pointed to, Sarah, have economic, political, social, historical, cultural, geographic, even dimensions, among others. So, for example, global climate change is directly linked to an extractive economic model of industrial capitalism, which is tied to colonization, the enslavement and forced labor of people, and political processes, again, that have been shaped significantly by a very well-coordinated fossil fuel and industry-led climate denial campaign, which Mark talked about. So I think, and we ask these questions, like basic questions that are linked to different academic disciplines or in schools, content or subject matter areas. It also compels us to think about climate change in terms of environmental or climate justice. For starters, the people in the world, the communities and countries least responsible for our climate reality are experiencing the most devastating effects. So I think a lot for us when we think about schools and what can happen in schools, it goes back to questions, inquiry. How can we cultivate classrooms and spaces where these kinds of questions can be posed and pursued rigorously among teachers and students? And when you do that, you open up these spaces for all these disciplines and perspectives and so forth that necessitate, the humanities being part of that process.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think if we look at social studies and humanities education in the schools, and I think even in the universities, it's what we might call a fragmented curriculum. These are sort of multidisciplinary subjects in terms of the study of history, social sciences, psychology, economics, and so on. And so there's competing priorities, I think, and I think teachers are very much dedicated to their subjects, and they're looking at issues, public issues, global issues, in a way that doesn't make the connection, that doesn't link things up. And I think that climate change offers an opportunity for educators to start to look at the relationships between the issues that they're teaching and care about and climate change, such as climate change and racism, climate change and gender, climate change and social injustice, climate change and looking at how the most vulnerable communities across the world are being impacted by climate change, those that are the least responsible, as James mentioned. And so I think that, again, this is not just an American phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon. UNESCO did a study of, I think, over 100 countries, and less than half had climate change in their national curriculum. And then when they surveyed teachers, teachers really were very keen to teach about climate change, but didn't quite know the way forward. So there wasn't a framework in place that helped them think about it. There wasn't a curriculum framework. Their schools didn't have a framework in terms of climate action. I think about a third of those teachers globally, and again, it was very well distributed in terms of geographic sample, I think. About a third said they're really more than a third. I guess it was quite the majority just didn't have an understanding of what do we mean by climate action for young people. What would that look like? How do we teach to engage students in climate action? So I think there's a number of issues here that we're talking about, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the curriculum is very fragmented. We're not seeing things in relationship, in terms of some of the issues that we're dealing with. I was at a panel discussion where it's mostly with European scholars, where they're talking about polycrisis. And this idea of these multiple crises. It's a crisis in terms of inequality, poverty, democracy, climate, and seeing these as very much interrelated. And so I think we need new frameworks for really thinking about these kinds of problems and the relationships between them.
Thank you so much, Mark. I just want to, before we hear from Allie, I just want to respond very briefly to say that precisely the lack of a climate curriculum is also the focus of what My Climate Story is doing this year, in which we are working with 9 Philadelphia high school classrooms and their teachers throughout the entire year. We've built a curriculum together, and it's being piloted in those. You can, if you would like that workbook for yourself, you can download it from the My Climate Story website. Over to you, Allie.
That's a great segue, because I was going to add on to, we work at the APS, the museum, with teachers, and especially with our just now ended community science project all the time, and those teachers are beholden to the standards that are in their community, and also the resources they have available to them. So a lot of times we see maybe not getting that sort of climate education, depending on where they are, the standards that are given to them, and the resources available to them. And that's why our community science project, and also just Becoming Weatherwise itself, museums in general, provide that sort of access to education, especially the APS. Our museum's free, our resources are free online, so that having that sort of free accessible information is always important. A museum is different from a classroom, in which that you can learn in different ways, and everyone does. That's the thing, everyone learns in different ways, and that's the wonderful things about museums. When Charles Wilson Peale opened his museum here in Philadelphia, he wanted people to be educated, to educate, but also have fun with it. And that's the thing about museums. We can provide this information in a lot of different ways, and can make it readily accessible. And that's also the great thing about becoming weatherwise is not just about science, right? It's about the history of science, the history of climate science. And it's having that interdisciplinary run through it. So it's history, it's art, it's science, and you're looking through it and you're getting this story. And a lot of times people don't realize, when you give them the whole picture, the history of it, they get to it a little bit better. It makes them help understand this is how we got here today. And these are ways in which we can actually move forward and do better. And that's, I could talk about museums all day, but I think too, museums are very important. All these resources, everything you've all been talking about is very important, but also just being able to have access to it as well.
Thank you so much, Allie, and thanks to each of you for those thoughtful questions or answers to that first question. Our second pre-circulated question, I'm going to ask you just to kind of have a sort of 2-3 minute answers, because obviously we are getting lots of questions that are coming in, which are also really wonderful. And I really want to kind of build or say maybe kind of despite some of the reservations we heard about scientists perhaps not welcoming humanists to the table, I think, we're also hearing lots of examples about how movement voices and advocates are actually really also changing what it means to constitute climate science and climate research, and to include and to really center climate justice in the questions that we're undertaking. I want to ask you guys, you have having great minds here, really to do some blue sky thinking and to really draw on what you're doing in your own work or where you're seeing really innovative examples of climate education happen, and really think with us about what your wish list might be for promoting climate education, both at your institution, but really to think really big, like also at the state, national, and global levels. Like, where does climate education need to go? What do we need to be doing? If you were the climate czar of the globe, what would you do? Over to you, Sarah.
Okay, I loved this question, and I'm really grateful that you gave us some time to think about this in advance so I could put my mind to it and not just be spontaneous. So we've probably all thought about this question a lot. There's already a lot of really cool stuff happening in California. I have to say that unlike Penn, Pennsylvania, which is, by the way, where I went to college, so I have an affection for Pennsylvania, but unlike Pennsylvania, California is doing fairly well on climate education. We have climate education next generation standards in K through 12. Actually, that is, I think I attribute that anecdotally to the reason why students in my college classroom started to come differently to the classroom affectively around climate change. And there's just a lot of cool stuff happening. You had mentioned in the question, where is this already happening in the work that we're doing? Adriana put some links in the chat of 2 projects that I've been part of, the UC-CSU joint system, the UC system and the CSU system put a huge amount of investment into thinking about advancing and transforming higher ed climate education. And we produced out of that sort of several year-long collaboration across the systems. We pulled together all the people doing climate stuff in all the disciplines. Interdisciplinarity and justice were actually 2 of the main kind of values of this group that came out of the UC Office of the President's Climate Neutrality Initiative, or CNI. And we produced Nextera, which is a website that Adriana has linked into the chat, which is all the sort of best practices and all the best ideas from this big group of how you might integrate climate in different disciplines across the curriculum, across different departments into the classroom. So I really wanted to point out that there's some really cool stuff happening around my wish list thing, though. In all of these spaces where people are talking about climate education, the thing that I keep coming in with is justice and emotions. So I think of this as like a Venn diagram. There's climate change, there's justice, and there's emotions. And you can have 2 out of the 3, and it's just, there's something missing. And in fact, it won't be transformational for students. And there's all the problems that we see, the interdisciplinarity problems that people have mentioned, kind of come out when we don't have those 3 things together, and from my perspective. And so my wish list would be, can we do much more justice-oriented climate education? And how would that look? Well, one of the ways it would look is a lot more focus on community building and community activities, whether that's through service learning or whatever it is, community-based learning opportunities, integrating community stuff with the classroom. The things that we were just talking about or hearing about with the museums is a great example of that, but there's an infinite amount of opportunity for integrating community with classroom stuff. And there's hurdles for that, of course, it's difficult, but that's one primary a sphere that work should be happening around or integrating justice. Another thing that has to happen there is I'm thinking about my wish list at my institution. There are so many opportunities for my institution to engage in Indigenous work and sovereignty, including land back opportunities, that they're just they're not stepping up to the plate as well as they could be. And the conversation around whether we could have this be a tribal college, all these kinds of questions about sovereignty and whether or not how that plays into climate adaptation and mitigation really hasn't been as central to the conversation as I'd like. So my wish list includes centralizing this land back and Indigenous sovereignty question in climate work on campuses, which is in California, like I said, doing pretty well. And then the second thing, so that's a justice-oriented question. What would a climate education from an abolitionist perspective look like? David Pellow's great work, What is Critical Environmental Justice Studies, says the best climate stuff or the best environmental justice stuff may not even have the word climate or environment in it. So where is that work happening and how can we bring that together more? And this was mentioned about fragmentation and bringing justice in. So those kinds of questions I think aren't as central as I wish they were. And then so the last thing would be emotions. My book is about emotions. I turn to thinking about emotions, and the science of emotions is very, very clear and just as clear as the science of climate on the centrality of emotions in our decision making and the energy that we have to engage for whether students are doing it or we ourselves are doing it. Whatever we call activism or action, emotion is at the center of that drives all of it. And so we don't, in general, in education, no matter what the subject, whether it's climate or not, we do not enlist the science of emotions to think about how emotions are shaping the learning experience for students, period. And in climate education, that's even worse. In most science education, it's even worse. And so we might have some trauma-informed pedagogy, for example, in something like Native American studies or feminist studies, but we certainly don't have it in many of the sciences, and most science faculty would think that's not relevant to my content. But environmental studies and climate studies, trauma is increasingly relevant to that content, and the vast majority of our students are experiencing some kind of climate trauma, if not some other kind of trauma. So trauma is just one way to bring in, just one example of what I mean by what would it look like to bring an emotional lens center to climate education. And it doesn't have to be just trauma. It can be thinking about the role of guilt in whether or not we proceed with environmental actions or climate action, thinking about the role of joy or pleasure in the classroom, not just like ending this terrible semester on climate education with 1 week of hope at the end and hoping that does the trick. The emotions of climate education.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to shut you down. Really want to love what you're saying. Want to move forward with James and Mark.
Yeah, I was nodding a lot, Sarah, so I won't kind of echo what you said. I'll just, like, a concrete suggestion, I guess, for next steps of a wish list would be for institutions, whether they're schools of universities or K through 12 schools, to craft a climate justice as part of their vision and mission statements, and then see where that leads. I think that's a really key starting point as a concrete next step.
I really appreciate that, James. How about you, Mark?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think I'm relatively new at my institution, but COP28, the UN Conference of the Parties, next year, in end of November, early December, will be in Dubai. So it's in the UAE. And I think this is really a great opportunity for networking and developing a vision among educators in the UAE, and actually, I think globally too. So for my institution, I'm hoping that we can build networks with other educators. I've been doing a little bit of work with Arizona State University, and they have really an excellent, I would recommend taking a look at, especially for the GLAM, I guess the galleries and museums and so on. They have a Turn It Around project at ASU, which is developed by youth. And I think more of these kinds of projects, and it really combines art, poetry, action. But there's a curriculum guide that I think is quite powerful. And I think these kinds of things that are very much youth developed and created, it's actually a message to education policymakers, teachers, and others around climate justice and moving towards climate justice. So I think these kinds of projects are very exciting, and I think we have to develop that vision, like James said, and start networking and working across different platforms. They talk about different. The turn it around is they talk about different turns. So making a paradigm turn, a methodological turn, moving away from that sort of colonialist paradigm to one that's really focused on justice and thinking more about indigenous people, land-based kinds of perspectives and so on. Anyways, I would just encourage people to take a look at that. I think it's a nice resource. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I really appreciate you also helping us understand how youth voices and centering youth voices and youth concerns is also kind of counterintuitive to the old types of educational models that we had, where, the old people were the experts. And it was very much like, you're an empty vessel. I'll just pour all my knowledge into you, and now you'll go and figure out whatever it is you're going to do. I think we all know that doesn't work very well. Largely, I think also because of our emotional economy and how we're built as learners. Allie, tell me about your wish list.
Yeah, so I guess so two big themes are accessibility and standardization, which go hand in hand with our exhibition. So moving forward in the next year, we're going to be putting lesson plans up, centering around our community science project, dealing with the same sort of lessons and activities we did with the two schools, and of course, just making sure it's accessible. It's free, it's online, readily available, as well as different programming. And that is what the great thing about being in museums. We're able to kind of work with teachers too, to see what they need in the classroom and how we can help provide those sort of materials. Another big thing too coming up for the APS is our for our Center for Digital Scholarship. We have our historic weather collection, and they're hoping to have it digitized and transcribed slowly. It's just the beginning of it, but having journals that we have, such as like Madison, Rittenhouse, having those sort of data that maybe is kind of gets put up, people get a little scared by that when they see these sort of primary source documents, and using that, getting that data and having it digitized and transcribed and readily available for the public. And it's in its early phases, but it's slowly but surely in the years it's going to be added on and made available to the public. So yeah, standardization and accessibility.
Fantastic. Love that concreteness. We have some really difficult and wonderful questions coming through in the chat. I'd like to just pose to you in briefer form the first one that came in, which really asks in its second part, given climate injustices and the way they fall disproportionately on communities of the global South and people of color, how might changing power structures help be actually the most effective kind of climate change response, as opposed to focusing on this tiny minority of climate deniers? I wonder if you have thoughts on that. And I'll just open it up to anyone who might want to respond. Mark, you spoke, I think, most sort of directly about climate denialism and the well-funded sort of backers that climate denialism has in the fossil fuel industry and elsewhere. I wonder if you want to kind of think about this question.
Yeah, and I think this is again where we might want to turn to youth and indigenous movements. I think youth activism is I think we need to forge greater solidarity with the people that are in the movements, and as academics, we need to be more engaged with communities, more community-based education, like Sarah mentioned. So I think it's looking at power structures within our communities. I think within our universities as well. I think that's something that I think that sort of identifying those sort of colonialist structures that are still in place in our universities that make it difficult for us to, engage with communities and, communities of activists, artists. But I think to do that work, it's going to require, I think, much more sort of solidarity and kind of networking, developing networks that are really outside of academia. And so, and I think it's doing research with people those kinds of things, I think, that are going to be necessary to start to make that sort of shift or pivot away from some of these power structures. So, I think, there's a lot of work being done, and we need to find ways to bring people together. I mean, I think, Sarah mentioned a lot of work that's being done in California, and I think, wherever we're located, there's things happening, and I think it's partly about connecting with those kinds of movements. So, I'm not sure if that's very specific in terms of.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, because I think it's going to have to. I mean, it's people coming together, having a vision, developing a shared vision, and then working towards that vision. And it's more of a democratic process, I think.
I appreciate that vision. I like that, Mark. We have a couple of questions that are coming in that I think really get to the kind of crux of this matter, which is that on the one hand, while we're talking about centering or even amplifying youth voices, we also, of course, are mindful that these are young learners and young people in general. And that means that they may not have whether it's the emotional resources, the educational resources, to do the types of leadership that we're actually kind of asking them to do. I feel like old people are copping out and being like, oh, youth, well, then how do we educate appropriately? How do we support youth? How do we hold them up? But also not expect too much of them. In other words, as the questioner is asking, how do you integrate climate education for young learners appropriately? And that's a really wide open question. I know, not easy. Do you want to kick us off, James? I know you've been an early education expert, teacher, as well as now professor.
Yeah, it's a comprehensive question, in terms of we can think really holistically across the grade levels, kindergarten right through high school into college and beyond. I think what's important, for me at least, to remember is that this effort, this broader educational effort around climate change and climate denial and moving toward climate justice and what that looks like, has to be an intergenerational effort, right? It's not the responsibility of any age group. I mean, this is a significant challenge. It's a mega problem, as defined by James Martin. It's part of a polycrisis, as Mark alluded to. So it really does require everyone to be invested in thinking through what the solutions might be. And that includes gleaning wisdom from our elders, as well as catalyzing the energy of youth movements. All of it is for Mark and me and the work that we've done is guided by a spirit and a commitment to inquiry. So these are questions we want to ask and pursue, and we have to examine a range of texts in our lives and how we make sense of those and how we move toward policies that are more equitable and justice centered. And that requires, again, all of us on all age groups and across institutions and organizations and schools to do that.
Hallie, do you want to jump in here? I'm sure that when designing the exhibit, this was something you had to think about quite a bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, so accessibility is the most important. Like, how are we getting this message across to multiple audiences in a clear way? And it's you take it like James was saying, it is intergenerational effort. We're all resources for each other, as my one colleague says. And so being able to kind of have that family, come into the exhibition, but be able to kind of talk to each other about what they're seeing and also their own experiences. Weather and climate are basic things. They're part of our everyday life without people kind of realizing it, and kind of seeing to those different opportunities. We create this exhibition to make sure that when people come through, they can make a connection at one point or another, right? This is an exhibition that goes from the 1700s to the 1900s. Whether people come away with, oh, those are some of those basic instruments that I see in my parents' backyard, my grandparents' backyard, maybe I can actually do that. And that's also a key thing, making sure people know that they can take part in this, that science is about everyone. Everyone can take part of it. Everyone can be a scientist, and everyone can produce this useful information, and also just empower them. So we have questions in our exhibition being like, hey, do you know what, maybe this is a new term for you. Let's talk about it. Or, hey, maybe leaving here, I can actually do further investigation and help better inform myself as well, or ask my parents. And we can also, work together to figure out what we're doing or what something means. Because just when they leave the museum, they also have to feel empowered to be able to look into these sort of things. So
I appreciate that, Allie. In the workbook that we've written about how to tell a climate story, we say, well, not everyone may think of themselves as an author, but we are all storytellers. For that reason, the workbook is organized as a series of recipes, because just like we are not all chefs, we can all cook. So we really going with that kind of participatory rhetoric. Sarah, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, I want to add something I love what James was saying there. And I often get asked the question, how should I deal with the emotional information you're telling me, Sarah, with my third grade class or my fifth grade class or my nephew or my niece or my own child who's X age? And I have no expertise on these ages, even though I have two children in that age range. Would give me expertise, but no. But, one of the things that I think the sort of generic answer, there are people who are really studying this. How do you developmentally in appropriate ways deal with climate education? And Ellen Kelsey's work on this is particularly fantastic. My overstatement about that, though, is that one of the big insights that I love so much is actually from Adrienne Marie Brown's work. And she basically says, feed what you want to grow. And her argument is, what would happen in our work and in our emotions if we turned our attention more and more by degrees towards the things that we love and want to nurture and we want to get bigger, the things that we want to grow in the world, like grassroots activism or pleasure or whatever, and not so much attention to that which we fear, which is a very provocative thing to ask people studying the climate. I think it's particularly important the younger you are. I think we can't expect young people to step into the roles we wish for them without having that huge foundation of love of the planet and the inhabitants of the planet, and a sense of relationality and kinship with the more than human world, and the list goes on. And so at the core of the medicine that will solve both the emotional problems that we're seeing in young people, especially inside or outside of questions of climate, we have a mental health crisis with youth. And the climate crisis itself, at the core, the root solution is the same for both. This medicine is the same for both ailments, which is relationality, which I think the humanities has been really clear about for some time. So again, a place for the humanities to enter into the conversation, and a real centrality of the role of emotion in doing this work. And yeah, it needs to be different for different ages, I think.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah, and also for bringing relationality into the discussion. I think that that is really central as well. Well, you're going to field one last question, and I'm going to make it a kind of hybrid question of two that were posed in the question and answers for us, and that has to do with another invitation to really ask you collectively to draw on examples that you may know of abroad, of particularly successful non-US based success stories for climate education. And I'll leave it to you to feel that, but maybe I could ask Mark to get us started.
Well, I think that for one, the United Nations has identified SDG hubs. So they're identifying universities that are really focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals. And so they're really, I think, identifying sort of exemplary universities in each of the areas that they're working in. So I would probably take a look at that, I guess. I think that one of the issues in higher education is, QS rankings, and I think we have this sort of global education industry that's really focused on human capital development, and it's really this developmental paradigm that we're sort of struggling against. I think it's focused on tests and PISA and these kinds of things, but the Times Higher Education survey of institutions is looking more now at social impact and how universities and research is making impact. And I think that's important for us to look at. And they've identified, I think, some sort of exemplary institutions. At the university level, I like the work of Tristan Cowan, who's at UCL in London, and he's looking at sort of higher education and climate change and talking about some of these shifts in paradigms towards more liberatory, sort of justice-oriented kinds of paradigms at the university level. I guess in terms of my own experience, I think Singapore, I was in Singapore for 15 years, and climate change is in the geography curriculum for young students. So throughout their schooling, they're getting exposed to climate change in geography classrooms, where it's more than just the science, it's also the human dimensions of climate change. And so I think that we need to see more examples of that where it's taught in the humanities. So it's both the physical and the human geography, I guess, more integrated kind of view of that. Yeah, so I think those are maybe a few examples worth taking a look at that come to mind immediately. I'd probably have to think about that a little bit more, but yeah, those would be some.
Those are great. Yeah. And we can, I've been on a lot of panels with different early education climate educators, and I am just constantly wowed by the materials that there's really a welter of resources and projects that we can put together, I think, and Adriana can send those out to attendees afterward. Any last words from James, Ali, Sarah? We are hard up on the hour.
I'll just quickly say, there's we haven't talked much about artists, youth artists, as well as artists, intergenerationally. All the work that they're doing to help us see what's how to understand climate change and advocate for ecological justice. I think that work is inspiring, and all of that work that's done throughout the world can be resources, curricular resources that can be explored and the object of inquiry in classrooms.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank all of you who joined us for this really illuminating discussion today. Thank you especially, of course, to our hosts at the American Philosophical Society, and most particularly to our panelists, Drs. Ray, Baildon, Damico, and Ali Rospond. It's been really great to talk and learn from you. I really appreciate it, and thank you.